So we have 4 objectives today that we want to achieve in the presentation. First is adopting information governance and records management. This was the main driver for the project, and we'll definitely do a deeper dive with respect to this objective. Secondly, project management during a pandemic. Well, this project started before the pandemic started, and so we had to do some twists and turns to complete the project, so we'll definitely talk about the lessons learned. Third, enterprise taxonomy and achieving user buy-in. Just like any project, in this project specifically, user buy-in is critical, so we'll explore that as well. And lastly, lessons learned, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a business perspective. So your host again, well, again, my name is Mike Denouden. I'm the Business Development Director with ARC Business Solutions. Very proud to say that I've been with ARC for over 12 years. I look after accounts here in Calgary, and I also run our Regina office. And joining me today is Zeke.
Thank you, Mike. Zeke Irabar, SharePoint architect turned Microsoft 365 productivity solution specialist. I provided the technology lens on this phase of the project.
I'd like to think that Zeke's also a SharePoint wizard. PowerShell is his magic. That could be a tagline.
Appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Stefan Moroniak. I'm the IT manager at the Real Estate Council of Alberta. I've been working at RECA for the past 9 years. I manage our IT infrastructure program, cybersecurity program, Office 365. I work with the application team, small one, for developing the MyRECA program, which is our customer portal for our industry professionals. I was the client and project coordinator. I'm also the senior records officer, and I'm excited to be here today with my ARC colleagues.
Thanks, Bob. And I'm Darrell Perrier. I'm one of the 3 owners of ARC, and I was the project manager for this project.
Thank you, guys. So some of you may be familiar with ARC Business Solutions and some may not. So I just want to take a quick moment to explain who we are as a company. We are an IT consulting company, and we have offices in Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, and Toronto. And with our offering, we have a number of different divisions or practices that we bring into the marketplace. So first is our solution delivery division. So whether our clients are looking for application or technology implementation, we can do this with the consultants that we have on our staff. So whether that's project managers, developers, testers, or trainers. And we can execute these projects with our own project management methodology, as we call it, the delivery management methodology, or we can execute with the methodology that our clients have, whether it's waterfall or agile, as an example. And another aspect of our solution delivery is our management consulting area. Most organizations have strategies or goals, but sometimes they may not align from an IT perspective. So our management consultants can be brought in to make sure that that alignment is real. Our second division is our managed services area, and we cater more towards small to mid-sized organizations and organizations that view IT as not full-time. So we can augment that with our managed services area. Our network operations center is in our head office in Edmonton, so they can do remote monitoring or support, or if need be, our technicians can be dispatched on site. Our third division is our mobile solution area. So we can first and foremost develop enterprise class applications through our project management methodology, or we can simply have products that are on the Google Play Store and the Apple Store, and most of those products are actually related to learning management systems. And our last division is our information management area, and which is why we are here today. So from a content management perspective, over the years, we've developed our SharePoint practice and doing a number of Office 365 implementations and really delivering SharePoint and Teams as well. So that's ARC. I'll pass it over to Stefan for a little brief on the Real Estate Council of Alberta.
Thank you, Michael. The Real Estate Council of Alberta, also known as RECA. RECA is the governing body for Alberta's real estate brokerage, mortgage brokerage, and property management industry. We're committed to the public interest by promoting the integrity of the industry and protecting consumers. Consumer protection is really key to our mandate. We set the standards for licensees to ensure they're competent, ethical, professional, and valuable to consumers. We have 72 employees in the organization, servicing approximately 15,000 licensed professionals in the industry. We have about 1,600 learners at this moment completing RECA education programs to become licensed in industry. And I just want to say our industry professionals have been very resilient during COVID. We've heard about lots of innovators working with their clients to be able to continue to buy and sell homes. And the good news is real estate industry was identified as a critical service, or essential service, I should say, early on by our provincial government. And this year, we had 96% of our industry renew with RECA, with only 4% attrition rate. That's the highest renewal number I have ever seen since I've been working here at RECA. And so I'm very optimistic for the future of the real estate industry here in Alberta.
So our first objective here today is adopting information governance and records management. As I said earlier, this was the main flux for the project. So I'll leave it to Stefan.
So these are the main problems that we were looking to solve with this particular project. Our organization had limited technical capabilities for effective records management prior to the project. We had this common problem of like storing 620,000 files mixed with 54,000 folders in this big repository that we call the Common Drive. Now this repository information was difficult to search. It was certainly painful to find the latest version of a file at times, and the access controls, the permissions at the folder levels was a challenge for our IT group. Going into this project, I knew that this was really the beginning of RECA's records management practice truly going into operation. Our goal was not to migrate and classify all the files, but focus on the data that matters and provides value to the organization. We have a small IT team, but we're agile. We punch over our weight category. Our IT team needs to understand the impact of this project and was involved with the transition, configuration, and was really effective during post support operation. We're in our final year of our business plan with strategic objectives still on the board. Kind of one of the main ones that stood out was the business continuity plan prior to COVID. And COVID became an opportunity to fast track that particular program. We have a great, diverse group of people here at RECA. And like the professionals we regulate, we have people that adapt in times of change. So we wanted to engage those staff with a cyber-safe digital workspace that our staff could be enthusiastic about and participate in the development of that online community. So why did we choose Office 365? Well, from my perspective, the technology matters. User experience is critical to user adoption, and our staff use Microsoft Enterprise products on a daily basis. So it made sense for us to select Office 365. Data residency in Canada is a real requirement, but we have the understanding that information is stored in our borders, but securely transmitted south of the border. So, we, as an IT person, I see, our information sometimes flows through Redmond, Washington, before those packets head east and hit Azure Central in Toronto. We have great partners in our orbit that allows us to be able to complete projects, and we have 3 competitive proposals on this particular project before selecting ARC. Security is always top of mind. Office 365 has lots of comprehensive security tools like advanced threat protection, cloud app security, data loss prevention, just to name a few. And those security tools include compliance reports. So your configurations are benchmarked to compliance reports like ISO 27001, PCI DSS, PIPA on the privacy side, and other compliance frameworks. And of course, staff engagement was a key driver for us on this project. Developing a digital platform that breaks down silos in our organization was really important. We wanted our staff to take ownership of the technology to communicate with their stakeholders on Teams and other Office 365 apps. Obviously, this takes time, requires us to listen with our staff to understand how they're going to use the technology. So at a high level, in terms of the Office 365 program, these were the three kind of main objectives: adopt, develop, and empower. We needed to adopt information governance through a compliance-based approach to implement document management, records management, and more broadly, information management. We needed to avoid that typical story where it's a simple file dump of our information or common drive to SharePoint Online. We wanted to avoid that typical lift and shift scenario. And we needed to empower our staff by consistent communication throughout the project with lots of discussions, comprehensive training, and sometimes more training to ensure our staff are engaged and ready to make that leap consistently using the technology. So these were the three phases that we put into the program. Phase one was completed last year, where we set up the initial tenant. When I say tenant, I mean RECA's Office 365 site. The main focus to phase one was the email migration. We have on-prem Exchange systems, and we were moving mailboxes into the cloud. We still have those Exchange systems, so we're a hybrid configuration supporting some of the application integration, service accounts, that sort of thing. We also developed RECA Live, a brand new internet portal to engage staff here at RECA. It's really the hub spot for everything Office 365. And finally, multi-factor authentication, mobile device management, safe country geolocation, all those security configurations went into that first phase. Phase two, it was this project. Here we are in 2020. The primary focus was the electronic files migration of our common drive to SharePoint Online, fully adopting records management practice in the process, and then fully leveraging Microsoft Teams. We were a Skype for Business shop using soft phones, and we moved into Teams completely using the cloud PBX. Phase three is on the horizon. Now that we have information in the cloud, we want to develop reporting capabilities, develop a Power BI type practice, custom applications, look for integrations where we can, and start using some of the workflow automation and AI components. In terms of information governance, it's really a three-step process for us: identify, assign, and classify. And prior to the project, it was really important that we had all of our ducks in a row as an organization. We did this by developing an information asset inventory of all the information that we store here, collect and store here at RECA. We started to assign responsibilities. Some of our senior leaders became information owners, and we wanted to make sure that we had their buy-in and they understood really their accountability to ensure that the information stays secure and it's retained for when it needs, it's retained for as long as it needs to be. We also identified information delegates. You could also think of information delegates as data custodians. And we worked really closely with our information delegates during the migration cycles of this project. We went really deep with regulatory obligations in terms of retention and ensuring appropriate retention identified for each of the assets. As a senior records officer, we had to define and develop our disposition and destruction requirements after a document lifecycle. So all of that had to be really worked out. We also rolled out information security scheme to identify the sensitivity of the information and really aligning records management practice with our information security practice. So Microsoft Office 365 uses sensitivity labels. This is the faculty to apply a security classification scheme. So if you apply a specific label, there may be encryption involved with that, digital rights management, and it's really specific to native Office files. So we're talking Word, Excel, PowerPoint. It's not great for PDF. The integration isn't quite there yet. So RECA developed a baseline SharePoint content type with 3 attributes. We worked closely on ARC on defining this taxonomy. So the first attribute is the document type. So what type of document is this? Is this an email, briefing note, agreement, identification? It's just a single tag to really give a generic label of the type of document it is. Then topics is really what describes that document and provides a lot of the context. And that's a multi-label field. So it could be a legal document that relates to litigation or accounting that relates to maybe CRA tax information. It could relate to the Canadian, government in Alberta, that sort of thing. So, and that particular field is really used to search for the different documents and records that we have in our tenant. And then finally we have year. The year format really came into 2 formats. So we had the calendar format, which is the more common one. That could be a document date. Doesn't necessarily have to be the date the document was actually created. And we also have the fiscal year, and that's very common for accounting records and our project records. And keeping up with taxonomy and keeping it as simple as possible was our secret sauce. What do you recommend to our audience in terms of developing a metadata scheme?
You hit the nail on the head, Steph. The old KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid, still applies when implementing a technology solution that you actually want your staff to use, which is why in this case we settled on just the simple 3 fields. The more metadata, the more document properties you push out to your staff, the less likely they are to populate any of them. So you definitely want to limit them to really the most meaningful ones. Earlier this year, Microsoft actually modernized both the term store management and content type hub features in SharePoint, which was good news to a lot of us who have that technology lens, because we were wondering if that was still going to be the leading practice for pushing out an enterprise taxonomy in SharePoint. Now, some of you might also be wondering, I thought this was a Teams webinar, why did we keep talking about SharePoint? Behind the scenes in Microsoft Teams, your files are still ending up in SharePoint team sites, unbeknownst to a lot of you even. So it's important to us, the solution experts, that this functionality remains modernized and supported by Microsoft, which it has been.
And the other thing that's really interesting is that term store. You really go through a process in identifying the type of enterprise labels that go in there. And for RECA, we're well over 1,000 labels now in our term store.
Yeah.
And it's a big job to manage that term store to make sure that those labels are still being applied and are being effective. The other thing that I want to mention is there really is a bridge now between Teams and SharePoint Online, where the modern search, where we can see this metadata now gets surfaced into the Files tab of the Teams experience.
All right, thanks, Steph and Zeke. So objective number 2, project management during a pandemic. As I said earlier, this project started before the pandemic hit Canada and the world. So again, few twists and turns needed to be had. So I'm going to pass it over to Darwin and Steph to chat about this objective.
So Steph, do you want to talk about how you kicked off the
Yeah.
initiative?
Yeah, thank you, Darwin. Really started in November, December, where we went through a due diligence process. We had 3 competitive proposals. 2 were really shortlisted within our committee. ARC came out on understanding of scope. Second was, it was very cost competitive compared to the other one. And third, ARC brings great people back to the table every time we start working with them. I'm glad that Zeke, Darwin, Deborah, who is our instructor for Office 365, came to the project. February was really about moving our telephony services that I mentioned before. So we had Skype for Business, we migrated to Teams. I think that was really key prior to COVID. In terms of the last week of February, that's really when we got the project started with our ARC consultants. And we finalized the information asset inventory to really begin the project at that point. And so in March, we really started working with our pilot groups, which was our communication services team. They're our champions. Darwin, why don't you walk us through the rest of the timeline here?
Sure. So as Steph mentioned in March, we had defined the metadata that we thought would be useful to all of the groups out in RECA, had piloted with IT and communications, and built out a schedule to do some refresher training. So since it was a year prior that all these tools started to get rolling out to people, we had found that some groups really embraced the technology and really had used Teams and were fully on board with things, and then others hadn't touched it very much. So we wanted to get everybody to a level playing field, and then start to get them prepared for what this project was going to look like and how they could work with their files on the file system and prepare for the migration. So that started off. And then we had planned to have through April and June 4 groups of migration with full on-site training, here at RECA on-site, and then do some change management and close the project out in the first part of July. It was a little bit interesting because everybody knows what happened in March. So we got COVID-19 kind of hit everywhere, and put some interesting perspective on the project. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Steph?
Sure, thanks, Darwin. So the week of March 16th hit, provincial government declared lockdown, school closures, the full bit. That really put a pause on the project at that point. I know my focus became supporting our staff, transitioning folks to work at home situation. That first week was really for me about getting laptops out the door, setting up our staff to work from home, making sure that they're successful. In behind the scenes, RECA developed a COVID team that was doing a lot of the planning, coordination, communication within Teams, Outlook, SharePoint. We quickly activated our IT disaster recovery plan, which is really well documented. And we had this moment when we realized we had to document our incident response to the pandemic, because that plan really became an input to the business continuity plan. Essentially, we had done a business impact assessment during the month of March and April on the fly as we were living this pandemic. So life changed. Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, Office became the hub for work. And Darwin, a great leader once told me, there will be a time when it feels like you're a pilot of an aircraft. Your friends and colleagues have all boarded the plane, and in the middle of the flight, something extraordinary will happen. You and your crew will have to make some quick, intelligent decisions to fix the plane, to keep it afloat, or crash and burn. And I'm happy to report here at RECA, we sure kept the plane flying. And so with all that, I mean, we really hit a lot of our recovery time objectives and making sure our essential staff, our frontline staff like reception, licensing, education, info services, were answering the calls within 24 hours. By the end of the week, we had all our staff connected to Office 365 at some capacity to ensure our staff were okay and staying safe. And Darwin, you and I met up the following week to discuss a strategy for the project. We talked about COVID as being an opportunity to change the project and adapt to this new work at home situation.
So that's exactly what we did. So we took a little bit of a gap in the project at the start of COVID and made sure that RECA knew that we could support them through that process and had some business continuity expertise that we could interject if we needed to. But then took and said, okay, now we can restart the project, and not knowing how long people would be at home, how do we redo this project and how do we reshape it into what it needed to be? So we planned it out and realized that we could take and reshape it and do some work at home training for RECA staff and do that within the existing budget of the project by retooling the back end part of it. So we did that, and we did remote distance training for all of the staff for what working at home was going to be like. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, we worked with Deborah Fox, actually did the training, and it was really more than Office 365 training. It was really about appropriate etiquette when you're working from home. We've transitioned from co-location to virtual teams. What does that look like? And that was really powerful because we brought the organization together in 2 different sessions, and it was really another kickoff to this project, another jump start. and it really built on the momentum that we had in March.
So then as we got out into May through July, we had a look at the 4 groups we originally planned to migrate and realized we had 3. There were some commonalities across them. We collapsed the plan a bit and saved a bit of budget by doing 3 groups of migrations as opposed to 4, although realistically we really had 4 anyways, because one group was quite complicated and had a lot of very large content, which we'll maybe get into as some of the lessons learned in the back end part of this presentation. And then we did all of our training remotely as well, which caused some challenges. Working inside of a Teams environment, as we see here, it looks great for single screen, but if you're wanting to see a system and train on it at the same time, that caused some challenges that weren't as pleasant as if we were actually in a classroom, but we worked through it all. And then had to do more change management, and I think that Steph's still got a lot of that going on, just because the organization is so different now than what they would have been originally, and if they had all been trained in person. And then close the project out in August.
I'll leave this one, Darwin.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had some project challenges for sure. Organizational change management is often a challenge, but the events that occurred in this project were extraordinary. An organization that, as an organization, we used to come into the office, communicate with each other face to face. This digital transformation from co-location in the office to virtual teams had changed the organization. And, those changes are not scars to me. Those are more like birthmarks. It's really a new way of doing things operationally. And Darwin, scheduling during the pandemic was certainly a challenge. It certainly delayed the project by a couple of weeks. Changed the timeline. What are your thoughts on that particular piece?
Yeah, so with everybody working at home, schedules were very different. So people had to look after their children and couldn't show up at regular sessions at normal kind of time. So we were able to inject more training, more sessions, be much more flexible than what we'd be in a traditional classroom setting to be able to get through the project. We did stretch the project out by an extra month from what was originally planned, or a month and a half, but we were still able to hit the original target budget.
In terms of alignment to information security policies, we have these policies that we want to make sure that we put into operation. And it's a bit of a challenge in terms of change management. A mentor of mine always said, security is not convenient. Getting folks on board for multi-factor authentication, email disclaimers, don't click the link disclaimers, reporting phish, all that is a lot to consume for our staff. In terms of long file names and multiple folders, Zeke, you're the expert in terms of the SharePoint side. Talk to us a little bit about the limitations and the technology for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a bit of a moving target for a lot of SharePoint solution architects in the past, and it still remains one. And that's the folder and file path limitations in SharePoint. We came across some folders, including the files themselves at RECA, that were over 500-600 characters in length. So one of the things we had to do was actually create some proprietary scripts to actually be able to move that content into the environment in the first place. We did find that the free out-of-box SharePoint migration tool was failing on those. But even in SharePoint Online, you're still faced with a 400-character limitation on your folder and file paths. That's, of course, after the host, so everything after whatever.sharepoint.com is included in that 400-character limitation. So that's definitely something you want to be mindful of as you're moving content across.
It's interesting. We were working with our information delegates as the primary stakeholders, and one of the things was reorganize your folders. We can't be 10 folders deep before we find a file, and so it really became kind of that mindset, a goal, objective to make sure that we were able to compress the number of folders in the system and really replace a lot of those folders with just metadata tags because they really describe the file, even tell a story if it's a 600-character file name.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. If we actually had some file names that were literally 120 characters in length, but we were able to pull some of the terms out of those file names and then use the 3 properties we've defined, the year, the topic, and the document type, and then populate those instead. A good rule of thumb for those of you just starting this type of project is if you have a folder and it only has 1 or 2 files in it, that folder can probably be a metadata tag, and that folder probably doesn't need to exist. You can pull those files up a folder or 2. But you're definitely not unique in this. Every organization has this sort of mess of folders and awkward file names on their file shares. So yes, it definitely helps to have a good month or 2 dedicated just to clean up of your existing stuff before even considering moving it into SharePoint and Teams.
Yeah, and a lot of our stakeholders even deleted files or archived them. So we did put, had a organization period there where certain files would be flagged not to come across. In terms of the limitation of the technology, Office 365 to enforce records management practice, we selected OneDrive for Business early on in the project, and because of that, and it doesn't have that modern view of the metadata, we're not able to fully enforce records management at this time, Zeke. And that's because a lot of our folks still work in the File Explorer view.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. They still have a ways to go. Earlier this year, they did finally release the modern files experience in Teams, which was a huge boon for this project. And many others out there who are leveraging metadata and SharePoint behind the scenes. Because before that was rolled out, you couldn't even see all of those custom properties in the files view, nor could you see all the wonderful SharePoint views you might have created for your staff or for your groups. That's now available. In my personal opinion, I know there are requests out there for Microsoft to do this. Being able to access that metadata and view that metadata within the OneDrive sync client will sort of be the holy grail of information records management, and I'm sure we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, they did it for Teams. Yeah. I would imagine at some point they're going to do it for OneDrive.
It's only a matter of time.
So this is a perfect example of what we've seen with SharePoint. So having an EIM division and working in a specialized area since 2009, originally in some much larger products out there, we always took a records management approach to all of our projects, and we're able to take best practices of even working with paper and pull them forward into systems. And there were ways of doing things that SharePoint just wasn't able to do. And it's starting to mature in this space, and we'll continue to see it evolve and give us more flexibility and more functionality as it goes.
All right, thanks guys. That was a great discussion. So objective 3, enterprise taxonomy, achieving user buy-in. You said earlier user buy-in is absolutely critical, specifically now with this project. Zeke, tell us some more.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So this is where technology definitely comes into play. We worked with RECA, and RECA designed this amazing taxonomy with these 3 document properties. We had the RECA content type that we were able to use the content type hub to publish globally. That's all fine and well, but how do you prove to staff that they should use these properties? How do we show them how to use these properties? How do we actually show them why they want to take their documents with these properties? So I'll just walk us through a few of the techniques we actually implemented. The great thing about these next few slides is these are things that you can take away to your organizations and start looking at implementing as well. So first and foremost, we had, as Steph mentioned, a whole bunch of folders all over the place. In some cases, file names that were hundreds of characters in length. And he spent quite a bit of time in what we were calling these war rooms with business owners and specialists from every area to start pulling values out of those folders, out of those document names, and start populating the term store with those terms. So document types, topics, and years. As he mentioned, there are over 1,000 terms in the term store now. One thing to keep in mind with your term store, it is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't be dissuaded from going down that path because it's going to be too much work. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's going to be a lot of work spread over time, and it's going to be continuously growing and evolving, and that's just how a term store is. So don't feel like you shouldn't engage in that because it's going to be a ton of work. So one of the first things we did is we used actually a long-standing feature in SharePoint that allows you to configure default values on metadata properties based on the folder that a file is in. So our first step was to migrate all of the folders across from the file share, just empty folders, no files. Then we worked with staff to pull out those values, and then staff would actually go through and start tagging these documents or taking these folders to automatically apply that metadata on the files. The third step was the actual migration itself, which as the files would come in, SharePoint would automatically start tagging them with those document properties. And this is just to avoid that awkward manual effort down the road of having to go and bulk edit properties after you've already migrated content in. So definitely something we recommend doing. Pull the empty folders across, set up default values on those folders, and then migrate your existing content in.
And as a result of that, we've got a structure where the users can then work with the metadata if they want to work with the metadata, work with the folders if they want to work with the folders, or use a combination of both to really get the power of the technology.
Exactly, Darwin. And this is one of the ways in which you could do that. So right out of box in SharePoint, and once again, this is functionality that has existed since SharePoint 2010, 2013, the on-premises versions, is once you have all this wonderful metadata, once you've populated all of your content with it, you can configure your search subsystem to actually allow users to search by those fields. So if I log into RECA's intranet portal today and I say, give me everything that is doc type : report, I type that in the search box, it's going to immediately present all files I have access to, regardless of where they are in your SharePoint environment, that have been tagged as a report. Or if I want to find everything that is topic strategy, or everything published in the year 2019. I can just plunk in those property searches and have those files appear immediately. So this is one way in which we could show users, look, all this wonderful metadata that we've auto-populated for you that you're going through a little bit more effort to tag your documents with. This is how you now use it to find your files easier and quicker than you used to in the file shares. Another thing we did is we went a few steps further than the out-of-box search. And we actually found a handful of wonderful open source search web parts that were built using the SharePoint framework. We took those off GitHub. They were built by the SharePoint open source community. We customized them and enhanced them just a little bit, deployed them on RECA's tenant, and we were now able to create a faceted search experience using those metadata fields right on RECA's intranet SharePoint tenant. Sorry, Seth, you had a question.
I just wanted to mention that this is just a very powerful tool to have a centralized enterprise search system like this, because you're part of many teams. Like for myself, I'm part of like 40 different teams within the organization, and there's a document I'm looking for, and I can't remember which team it's actually in. It could be on many different SharePoint sites. I can come to the centralized search portal, type in the context that I need to search, and get really refining, using the refiners, exactly what kind of results I actually need.
Exactly, and this is familiar to users because we all use this on a daily basis. If we go to Amazon and we want to find a TV, let's say, you go and you type in TV, and then on the left-hand side you say, okay, I want it this price range, I want it to be Samsung, I want it to be this color, this size. That is a faceted search experience. And now in RECA, you can do that. You can search for, in this case, licensing and say, okay, I want it to be a report and I want it to be based on this particular topic, which is quite powerful. I just want to send more kudos out there to the open source community. Microsoft has fully embraced these open source web parts and developers out there. So for those of you who are maintaining a SharePoint tenant or tenancy in Microsoft 365, and there's something the business is asking you for, but it's going to be too expensive or too prohibitive to build, go and look in the open source community and see if somebody's built a web part or a SharePoint framework component that you can just plug into your environment and start using.
So we've got a question that someone has asked here that maybe I could suggest a two-part answer. They're asking, is there any functionality around Outlook? Is SharePoint integrated with emails? Maybe, Steph, if you could talk a little bit about what RECA does with Outlook, and then Zeke, if you could talk a little bit more about what else could be done in that space.
Yeah, in terms of Outlook, there was some changes around how we handle email retention, and really the big change is information security classification. So if I have very sensitive information, I mark it as private information or highly confidential, it has specific layers of security like email encryption. And so if I add an attachment to that, it also encrypts that. That's important to note because when I'm sending out an encrypted email to an external stakeholder, and their system isn't Office 365 federated, they may need to go through a one-time password, that sort of thing. But in terms of like searching in Outlook to SharePoint, typically we're doing that through either Teams or this centralized search hub. That's typically where we would go for searching for documents.
Yeah, so what if there's an important email that comes in from an external party and somebody wants to be able to capture it so that other people can reference it and get access to it? How does that work?
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah.
You want that?
Sure, I'll take that one. So there are actually several ways, and a lot of you will find this in your Microsoft 365 environments. There's several ways to attack some problems. So back in the day, back in the olden times in SharePoint on-prem, we had something called a mail-enabled document library, which is a very popular function where you can actually give a document library an email address. And Darwin, in your use case, you can CC that document library on important emails. You can actually replicate something similar in Microsoft Teams by giving a channel in a team an email address. So every channel actually has its own unique email address. And because behind the scenes, your files and Teams are ending up in SharePoint, any email that comes into that channel ends up in the SharePoint site that's underlying there. Therefore, any metadata you've configured on that SharePoint site or any IAM or ARM policies are then applicable to that email. And to your point, Darwin, members of that team can also access the contents of that email.
Great. So maybe next slide, Sal.
Lastly, library and list views were another way in which we surfaced metadata. Common theme, these are all ways in which we actually presented these wonderful fields to the users. Steph went through a number of the most popular document libraries and created something called the all document or the no folders view, where you flatten the view, you show all files regardless of what folders they're in, and then you present the document type, the topic of the year, and allow users to filter and group on those fields.
Yeah, that was a really powerful way of, developing a view that doesn't show folders and getting our staff members a lot more familiar with the metadata and having that, as you said, the eBay experience where they can use filters and really drill into specific views and get them to save those views.
Exactly.
So one of the common views that a lot of people say is the My Files view, where they look for specifically files that they've created or have modified, and they can bring those files to the top when they're working in SharePoint Online.
One of the things that helped us really well through this project was when we did the initial training with the groups, we had already migrated a lot of the key documents that everybody in the organization refers to on occasion. So by having those be available and be able to train on how the technology works, then they can take that away and apply that off to their own data, get a better quality result at the end.
All right, so that brings us to our last objective for today. So lessons learned, again, not just from a business perspective, but also technical as well.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So compliance-based approach is important to ensure your organization takes on a project like this. So you got to make sure that you have the appropriate people, information owners identified in the organization, really understand the information. We did that through the information asset inventory. Zeke, what strategies or tactics should an organization adopt for effective information governance?
Just to peel that back a couple layers, first and foremost, it's understanding what the technology is capable of at that point in time. When we started this project, the security and compliance features in 365 were quite a bit different than they are now. I think one key technology takeaway is to understand the difference between a sensitivity label and a retention label. I feel like a lot of people are quite confused as to what those are used for. Your sensitivity labels are to secure content when it leaves the organization. Your retention and classification labels are there to manage your disposition and deletion policies.
Yep. And this understanding of a document versus a record. So your retention label will really determine, is that record or is that still a document where you can still modify it. Darwin, the pandemic really reshaped the project, but also our organization as a whole. How has the pandemic affected the people at ARC? How has your organization adopted with this kind of new way of doing business?
Yeah, so it's definitely been interesting for us as well. Our offices are still closed. Everybody is working from home, and different clients have different experiences and different needs. So some clients in some of our locations were fully on site. Some were working from home. We really got the ability to be able to do both and figure out what works well. I think it's going to change the world going forward with way more remote work happening, but still it's nice to see people face to face.
Yeah, Zeke, and so strong methodologies to introduce and adopt records management. I know we had a pretty good action plan with working with our stakeholders, reorganizing the files at the source before we moved it to the destination. We also had the auto tagging through the folders. So we brought the folders first, and then we brought the files. Is there other things that you would recommend, or what are your thoughts?
I think we actually did it in a fairly methodical approach along this project. Once again, I'd say training is absolutely paramount because once you have all your content in there, all that new content that's produced or anything that wasn't tagged during that initial migration, we need to make sure that users are consistently populating these properties on those documents. Because down the road, when you go and create your labels and your policies to automatically apply those retention and sensitivity labels, you can actually leverage that metadata to identify documents, right? So if your organizational rule is that every financial report needs to be tagged as a record and held on for 5 years, you can then target everything that is a doc type of report that is of a certain year and then automatically apply those labels. So once again, training and metadata is critical.
I think developing a centralized enterprise search experience was very important in this process. Also, just leveraging the technology. Now that we've implemented the project, we've got other business units leveraging the technology in a new way. So for example, we do virtual hearings as our main process to conduct hearings. And what does that mean? Well, the hearing is conducted in Microsoft Teams. The files are conducted or are put into Microsoft Teams through secure private channels. And that whole hearing process is now done virtually. We also have remote proctoring for RECA learners. We had some supply chain challenges with our education programs where we couldn't do exams all of a sudden. We couldn't administer exams because those exam centers were not open. So, you know, in typical RECA fashion, we innovated and we implemented a remote proctoring where our learners simply need a webcam to be able to log into their exam. We also have online brokerage practice reviews. So our auditors are now using Microsoft Teams to review what's happening at the brokerage. Again, we're using Teams, we're using private channels for brokers to submit securely their information and coordinate with our auditors through that process. And just, you know, overall, where we're at as an organization is very different from where we were earlier this year. We are certainly looking for new ways to get away from that paper copy document and making it electronic and making that whole process online, electronic, using the technology.
All right, that was a fantastic discussion. Thanks, Steph, Zeke, and Darwin. So if you recall, at the beginning of the presentation, there was 2 polling questions. The first, has any project been affected by the pandemic? And the answer, yes, was 76%. So majority of the participants online, you were on a project and your project was affected by the pandemic. And the second question, have you used Microsoft SharePoint and Teams in a project before? And overwhelmingly, yes, 95% of our participants said yes. So hopefully what you've learned today from a detailed perspective of using it helped further on down the line. So we actually do have some questions from the audience members here. So first question, from a training perspective, what was the biggest challenge as all your training was done online?
And that's really getting people connected. You know, it's interesting. We had a couple scenarios where folks weren't connecting, and we kind of quickly realized that you know, bandwidth matters is what I say, and you know, we had to work with them. Actually, even some of our IT folks went, you know, in proper gear to get people connected, working in Microsoft Teams, because all of our training was done through Microsoft Teams. And it's really also the engagement. It's a little bit challenging to engage where your participants are, how are they doing? You know, can we engage them virtually? Not the same as we did before face to face, but can we just check in on them and, you know, ask those probing questions to make sure that they're understanding the material, that sort of thing. And kind of finally, it's just that follow-up training is really key. You know, we do the training, you know, it might be for 2.5 hours on an afternoon. It's a lot to process. Our business units and stakeholders would go away, and then 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks later, we would do some more follow-up training, or at least get some Q&A sessions going. I think that was really key to the success of our change management practice.
Okay, that's great. So I think this next question is for you again, Stefan.
Okay.
So have you realized an immediate collaborative improvement with using Microsoft Teams?
You know, we have a specific functional structure in the organization, and it feels like that's gone to the wayside a bit. What I mean by that is, you know, I receive communications from all staff throughout the organization, and it's not, you know, typically facilitated through a manager or a leader. And I think as an organization, our leadership is okay with that. It's okay to you know, someone in accounting to reach directly out to someone in licensing, and that's fine. But you know, what I will say is there are times where it goes silent and you kind of need to check in on people. And so to continue that collaboration, we do have to, you know, post a fun Giphy and say, hey, look at this, and how's everyone doing it? Is everyone staying safe? That's really important, is to have that regular conversation every day. For the IT team, for a long time, we would hold our daily scrum first thing in the morning. What are you guys doing today? What did you do yesterday? Was there any blocks to getting your work done? You know, those sort of strategies or tactics was really important.
Perfect. Okay, so we have 2 other questions. Okay, so is co-authorizing used in the organization? And if so, was there a reluctance to use the technology?
Yeah, great question. So there's certainly some change management challenges for certain folks when it comes to co-authoring. You know, I own this document, this is my document, stay out of my document. But I can tell you, like, we have a education programs group that develops curriculum. It was eye-opening. It was certainly a change for them, but they have embraced that technology. And I think co-authoring is just a fantastic feature, especially in Excel, like where I'm working with different people in parts of the organization that you know, has that central, you know, visibility on all my Excel files, like, and just having that same look, and then to even see where their cursor is and see what they're working on that Excel, and you know, seeing that new information pop up, it's very powerful co-authoring.
And even working through the training, we had some questions in there about, you know, how can I lock this and not show this to anybody until I'm done with it? And as we showed them what the experience was like with 2 people working in the same document at the same time, they were willing to, well, let's work together on this, as opposed to, I'm not willing to share this until it's done.
Well, and you also offset that with versioning. You know, you can show people, okay, so you know, the technology is tracking versions of this document all the time. You know, if there is ever a moment where you need to roll back and fork that document and save it as a new document, you have that capability. So I think that gave some of our staff some comfort that there was always that way to go back if they ever needed to.
There's another question in here talking about searching for documents and having that search not be the same view for everyone, and customizing that on a department basis or on an individual basis. We can talk about both we have there?
Well, I'll answer that one, Zeke, and I'll pass it back to you. So the centralized search, the look is the same for everyone. It's really just a standard look, the way the web parts are designed. If you don't have access or permissions to a file, you won't be able to search it. And so that's kind of the main difference. And you know, like there are some sites, I'm going to be quite honest, that don't have the full metadata populated yet. And so we're just searching content and file names in that regard. And so when you start using the refiners, you might lose sight of some of those files. So that can be certainly a challenge.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, the site architecture in SharePoint Online has drifted quite a ways from how we used to have it, where you know you'd have a departmental site, and then within there you'd have BUs or teams, and it'd be this hard hierarchy of sites within each other. Microsoft 365's paradigm has been more search all of your content regardless of where it lives, whether it's in Outlook and private chat, in your OneDrive, in your SharePoint sites. So that was what we tried to target with our centralized search approach, is find your file specific to you regardless of where they're located. That being said, for those of you who still have a traditional site architecture out there, the third-party web parts that we used, those can be enhanced to allow you to specify specific departmental search locations. So you could still build out a department by department search experience using those open source web parts.
So how about the custom views as to looking at different characteristics of files and having those visible to people? I know that's something that we train through some of our training sessions. Do you have any comments around how many people have built custom views and how they're using them today? Do you have visibility of that stuff?
Yeah, I would say the typical view I see is, what are my files? Like bring my files to the top, and that my files view is pretty common. I will say, in terms of working with your stakeholders, in our case our staff, you know, we sold it with, you have essentially an Excel overlay of metadata on your documents. We're just showing you your documents in this web application that can be manipulated like Excel. And so I think a lot of people, that kind of analogy, it clicked, where they're like, okay, I can just, this is like Excel, I can use this like a table, I can filter, that sort of thing, and do group by. I mean, that's also very powerful. So to go back to the question, there are some people that are power users that are using the custom views all the time. The most common view I do see is the my file view, which is the files that I'm working on.
So we are at 1 hour, but we just have one last question, and it's related back to one of the previous questions that was done before. So how do you manage co-authoring in a document at the same time? Do you pre-plan or discuss who will be working on which section of the document?
Yes, yeah, absolutely pre-plan, because you can stomp on each other's content if you're certainly not careful, and that goes for, you know, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, all of that. So yeah, and I think, you know, for the way we work is you have a ongoing Teams call, for example. Like you could have like an audio call with your colleague that you're working on this document with. You don't necessarily need to be talking to them all the time, but at least if you are co-authoring with a colleague, it's a good idea to like connect with them first, have the plan, and then maybe stay on the line and say, hey, like I'm just also researching this other piece of content. Take a quick review and see what you think. But it sure really changes the way we do work, right? And so we're trying to like mimic what we do in the office by talking to each other over the cubicle as we are doing it in the technology.
Do you get very many requests to help recover parts of documents or things like that if people step on each other, or is it all working fairly well today?
Yeah, the common request coming into IT is really typically authentication, and I know that's common. So OneDrive sign-in is pretty common, but we really don't get a lot of requests to revert content or revert documents back to a prior version, and they have that power to do that. That's the great piece, is we trained our staff to see, you know, that chain of versioning in that document. So if they do want to revert, they can do it themselves.
Okay, so if there's any additional questions, my contact information is on the screen, so please reach out to me. But I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. It will actually be posted on the ARC webinar, or sorry, the ARC webpage in the next few days, and also on YouTube. So once again, thanks to Steph, Zeke, and Darwin for their content and their contributing nature for this webinar. And we will be talking to all of you very soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for connecting.
Thank you.